Okay, great. We're just going to give it like 2 more minutes so a few more people can join you, and then we'll start. Thank you. Taking the time to be here. I'm Jemima, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar today. On behalf of the Center for Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Studies, African University of Science and Technology, AUST Abuja, we would like to welcome you to the second decarbonization webinar series on the topic, Just Energy Transition Strategies to a Cleaner Future. Thank you all for being here, and we'll just get right into it, and I'm sure more people will join in as we go along. So to start off, I'm going to be introducing the center leader who will give us the opening remarks for today's webinar. So Chidiebele Uzo-Agba, can you please go ahead and give us the opening remarks for today's webinar? Thank you.
Thank you, Jemima, and good day, everyone. My name is Chidiebele Uzo-Agba. I'm the center leader for Center for Climate Change, Adaptation and Mitigation Studies, African University of Science and Technology. African University of Science and Technology was founded in 2007, and as one of the Nelson Mandela Institutes. It was created with the idea of developing African centers of excellence in science and technology, and to foster innovation in the fields of, in all the fields that are related to science and technology in sub-Saharan Africa. And today, the university have master's, PhD, and undergraduate studies. At the Center of Climate Change, we are involved in research and development and capacity building and helping organizations and countries of nations to design policies around climate change issues. And we know that today, the inescapable truth is that climate change is here with us, and we have to do something about it. And again, for Africa, which is the context we're going to have the discussion today, we really need to define our strategy in energy transition, which is in pari passu with the climate change issue. The African energy system face complex challenges, and we know that. And Africa today, hosts about 80% of the 733 million people globally that do not have access to electricity, and 37% of the 2.4 billion people without access to clean cooking solution. And this changes, and this requires that the status quo needs to change. And for it to change, it requires some kind of game-changing policies and investment. And on the typology as we have today, just energy transition, we have renewables, we have solar panels, we have winds, we have hydro, we have geothermal, and even nuclear, as we're going to hear some of our speakers speak today. And so even at last COP, Conference of Parties, COP27, we have parties and delegates pushing that nuclear, we imbibe nuclear in Africa, even for everyone. So in Africa, we need a new paradigm. We have to, use what we have to get what we want, especially the raw materials and the things we have. We don't have energy, and we need energy before we can start talking about transition. And so today, we're going to listen to our speakers. And for me, transition is not just renewables and all of that, but it's just a pathway of, or rather a path of journey that you have to remain within your carbon budget for nations and for organizations. And therefore, I welcome you to this webinar and do have a wonderful time. Thank you. Over to you, Jumaima.
Thank you very much, Chidebere, for the introductions and the opening remark. Today, as he has mentioned, we're going to be discussing what this just transition in terms of energy can be in Africa and how we can achieve like decarbonization here in Africa, given our own specific context. Today's program is we're going to have 3 speakers, and then we're going to sort of have a discussion, question and answers, and give everyone the chance to sort of interact and ask their questions. It's going to be a very interactive session, so just bear this in mind. And if you have any questions, you can keep them till the time for the question and answers. Since 1995, the World Bank has provided more than $3 billion to support governments closing coal mines and power plants and ensuring a just transition that safeguards jobs and incomes in affected communities. Africa has been on the forefront of this. They've been particularly interested in a just transition in Africa, and this is a chance for us to achieve this here. But we have to really consider what this just transition really means for Africa. And shouldn't it consider like Africans at the center of it and have us at in mind when it comes to this just transition? Today, we're going to be discussing what this will look like for us. What are our options here in Africa? Currently, energy security is the top priority for Africa. As we can see with our growing population, with the youth size in Africa, and even just for development and economic development in general, energy is at the center of everything here. So today we're going to be discussing this just energy transition strategies to a cleaner future in Africa. And that's what our speakers will be talking about, each one giving their own perspective on the discussion in general. To start off, we're going to have a speaker from the Federal Ministry of Power, Engineer Kingsley Odoh, MNSE, who is the Special Advisor to the Honorable Minister of Power for the Federal Republic of Nigeria. However, unfortunately, he couldn't make it to join the meeting due to an unforeseen situation, but he has graciously shared with us a video which we will be playing right away, giving his presentation. With regards to questions, or if you have any thoughts about his presentation, you can keep the questions and we will get them to him eventually. Thank you very much. So over to you, Chidebere.
Okay. Please confirm if you can see the screen.
Chidebere, we can see the screen, but we can't hear the sound. Can you check that, please?
I've been invited to speak on the topic, Just Energy Transition Strategies for a Cleaner Future for Africa, or to a Cleaner Future for Africa, I think something like that. So it's a very, very germane topic. Everywhere you go today, you hear energy transition, pathways to a just transition. And I'm glad that the topic here speaks to a just transition. But before I go into the topic proper, I want to first thank the organizers for having me, for being on your webinar. I want to thank you for thinking that we have some perspective to this. Let's believe that our perspective will not be some form of disruption, because we are in the real world practicing energy transition and stabilizing all kinds of transition issues that we have. So on the side of real practice, which is not the events that we've had all over the world, typically COP26, COP27, all speaking, but the reality of it is another kettle of fish. So let's speak to this. Again, let me mention this very critically. It's a very critical aspect of this whole thing. I should have been at your webinar physically, but again, because of the kinds of responsibilities I have, I'm not able to come physically, but I'm sure this will do. I'll be able to manage my time properly in the future to accommodate a physical engagement, which I know would, attract a lot of fireworks and questions, and, be able to engage along those lines. But suffice it to say that this recording will do for now, and thank you for creating the opportunity to have this recording. Now let's go straight to the topic proper, just energy transition. Like I mentioned earlier, we're speaking to a just transition. A just transition will seem to speak to fairness, will seem to speak to understanding a balance in various global approaches. The approach for the third world nation will certainly be a different approach for the very developed nations. And so just speaks to some kind of balance, and which is what I really would want to dwell on in this discussion. Let me speak to the reality of our world. Africa, and specifically Nigeria, has a lot of things they're battling with. Of course, you have heard of security issues, which is all over Africa, all kinds of issues of well, I don't want to speak to poverty, all kinds of things. So the challenges we have in Africa are much more. It's heavy, and we cannot discount these challenges in dealing with energy transition issues. So one very critical thing, again, today that disrupted the world is the Ukraine-Russia war, Russian-Ukraine war, whatever way you want to put it. But that had caused the disruption. First, you know that the energy transition discussions have totally changed. One, because energy issues have become issues in the front burner in the Western world, and this discussion it's been challenged a bit. Why? Because you can see in Europe, issues of energy or even gas, or even fuel to keep the heating system running has become a big challenge, and people are resorting to burning firewoods. Cost of gas had gone up. Cost of everything has just totally changed. Why? Because of one disruption. In Africa, we have several disruptions. Several things are disrupting our daily lives in Africa. And therefore, we must be able to have all these things at the center of our discussions while we talk about energy transition. Now, survival has become critical, and Africa is a place where people need to survive. Now, when we talk about energy transition, we're talking about decarbonization, commitments that have been made by various countries. Nigeria specifically, we've committed to full decarbonization by 2060. It means that net zero positions across our platforms. Very ambitious commitment. Again, all the national determined contributions, NDCs of various countries have been put on the table, and then it requires the funding. Nigeria specifically needs about 410 billion, to fund our pathway. It means that what we need to gravitate towards net zero, 410 billion. This is over the surface expenses. We've not talked about the nitty-gritty expenses. Now, how do we raise these monies? Developed nations must contribute to ensuring that this happens. Now, I know that a lot of things have happened globally that would, it's begging the question, are we able to really honor these pathways or honor these commitments that we have made? I recall that in Glasgow, COP26, commitments were made, all kinds of plenaries, and then COP27 came. Commitments were also made, and when we look back at the commitment in COP26 in Glasgow and the one that we had just recently in Sharm in Egypt, looking back, none of these commitments that were made in COP26 had been honored. None. And so people begin to ask, why are we not even fulfilling part of these commitments to be able to push towards net zero? And so these are grave concerns for all of us. Now, the good thing for Nigeria is that we have gas, and gas is one of the acceptable transition fuels. Fantastic. So we have a lot of work to do to develop our gas infrastructure, of course, with other renewable sources. But gas is the lowest hanging fruit for us in Nigeria. So the things that we can do is to develop the gas infrastructure, the gas value chain, ensure that a lot of things that we do gravitate towards cars that are driven or fueled by gas, aircrafts, just name it, across the value chain of transport and even our power plants. Let us see how we can ensure that gas takes center stage in all of this. And that will be good, because that's the lowest hanging fruit for us. So I know there are all opportunities, hydrogen opportunities, wind, solar, and all of these renewable options. They're fantastic in themselves. But the first thing that we should do as a nation and as Africans is look for what is the lowest hanging fruit on your transition pathway. If you know what it is, identify it and focus on developing it, fanning it to flame to drive, your energy transition plans. Let's not forget, today, China still runs 50% of its power operation capacity on coal. The United States, these are all at the forefront of all of this. United States runs 21.9% on coal. And this is as we speak today. Nigeria has a coal facility and infrastructure that is untapped, largely untapped. And we're saying, don't touch it, nobody will invest in it, because you cannot source investments from the European credit agencies, ECAs, or even the Exim banks of our world. But we must rally ourselves, because China says that they are able to get coal that the carbon emission is insignificant, if you like. America had not made those commitments, but today we know that United States of America runs 21.9% on coal of their entire energy value chain. Power value chain. So there's fossil, there is coal, and there's, of course, wind and solar and all of that. We must tell ourselves, Nigeria, for example, I'm still trying to get the quantum of coal that is, that we have as reserve in Nigeria. But we must structure to develop it and to make sure that we have the best of technologies to drive it so that the carbon emission is low. Globally, coal is the cheapest form of fuel. And we're saying, why can we not explore what we have? that nature has given us. So I'm saying that these disruptions are critical. For me, like I said earlier, I said this because it's important. I said I am not saying I'm not telling you these things because it's what's acceptable and what's accepted by global standards of energy transition. But I'm saying this as an African and as a Nigerian, and the truth that we have in terms of our reality today, that we have gas, we have coal, our wind is not very, okay, unless in the northern side of Nigeria, we've got strong wind, but not comparable to Egypt. Egypt, I see that they have massive roadmap for wind, with a whole coastal line to be able to do all of those. Fantastic. That is, again, their lowest hanging fruit. Let's define what we want as Africa. Look for your lowest hanging fruit, develop it. If it's in line with the energy transition plan, remember, your topic is strategies for this. If it's in line with the energy transition plan, so be it. If not, go and explore strategies and technologies that would ensure that the carbon emission in your technology, for example, in our case, coal, let's find ways to ensure that the carbon emission is low. And there are technologies to explore to make sure that the carbon, or even combined cycle, so that as it comes out, the carbon is reused to be able to, what comes out to the atmosphere is clean carbon, if you like. So I'm saying that these are things we need to do. So if you ask me, I would say, one, explore our gas opportunities. It's massive. Two, because, we have huge reserve of water, maybe down the road when hydrogen becomes very fantastic, we should also explore the hydrogen opportunity as a source of fuel. Three, wind. Hydro is already very heavy for us, so we are good. Hydro today, our hydro capacity is good in this country. If we harness it, it can give us up to 10 gigawatts, if not more. So hydro is fantastic. Wind and solar. Solar is good because we've got huge sunlight. Wind, maybe just a section of the country. So these are the things, areas that Nigeria must look at, or Africa indeed, because there are peculiarities in all of the African space. So things we must look at, but every country must look for its lowest hanging fruit. In the case of Nigeria, it is gas. We have it 200, I think it's 200 cubic, about 200, I think it's 200 cubic metric tons of gas in our reserve, untapped. And I'm saying we can, but please, that's arguable. So, but I need to reconfirm that, but I think that's what it is. So, we have gas, so we can refine and ensure that we develop strategies to ensure that our gas value chain is properly mined to give us what we want. Especially not forgetting that it's one of the energy transition fields. Secondly, is can explore those opportunities as well. Hydro is good for us. We've got lots of waterways, volumes of water seated in various up north, waterfalls, all kinds of things. So we can explore that. Third in the category is sun, which is solar, and the fourth is maybe possibly wind. These are the strategies I think we can. And let's not forget, I will not stop until I talk about coal, which is the fifth for us. Fifth, coal must be explored because we've got huge reserve, and I think it's important for us to explore these 5 strategies to be on the pathway for the future for Africa. Thank you very much for having me. If you have any questions, I'm glad to take them, but maybe offline. I'll pass them to me, and I will deal with them in the course of time. Thanks for having me, and do have a great day. I wish you guys wonderful deliberations as you talk about cleaner future for Africa. Thank you.
Okay, That was a really insightful talk from engineer Kingsley there. So now we're just going to discuss some more about it. I think some of the key points that I got from his talk in general was African countries really need to look at the lowest hanging fruit in Africa. So what are the energy sources that are available, and how can we explore them towards like cleaner energy and towards actually being good to our environment and the climate. Some of the examples that he gave there that some African countries can consider are things like gas, for instance, he mentioned in Nigeria, and how we can utilize that better and then make it also better for the environment with new technologies, solar, hydro, and wind. And then the somewhat controversial one, which he mentioned there, but I understand where he was coming from in terms of using coal as well. But then mentioning that perhaps we can create new technologies for using coal in a way that it will be less harmful to the environment. I'm sure that's one that will get a lot of people thinking, and it's one up for debate and discussion. So like he said, if you do have any questions for him or any points at all that you would like to discuss, you can share them with us in the chat, or you can send us an email and we will forward them to him. But that was really insightful, and it was there were a lot of lessons in there for all of us. So our second speaker, who I'm going to be introducing now, is a multi-award-winning communication specialist and a lifelong nuclear technology advocate from Inanda in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Her globally recognized work involves providing high-level strategic support to the government in leading, executing, and ensuring the success of nuclear communication strategies. With over 13 years of experience in the nuclear industry, her contributions to the industry include founding Africa for Nuclear, an advocacy campaign that promotes nuclear energy as a key contributor to achieving Africa's agenda for sustainable development. She's here to discuss the role of nuclear energy in Africa's energy transition. Please welcome Princess Ntubeni, also known as Princey. Princey, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamina, and greetings to everyone. I'm currently sitting in a car because I'm working on the field. So I'm going to switch off my video and when I do the presentation. But before I move to my presentation, I'd like to clap for Engineer Kingsley because everything that he said is everything that I believe in myself. So yeah, I'd love to meet him one day. I'm going to project my presentation. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm sort of. Can someone assist with my presentation? I'm battling here.
Okay, let me check.
I can share for you, Princess.
Please, thank you so much. Can I have, okay. I'm going to be talking about nuclear technology for Africa's agenda for sustainable development. Can I have this next slide, please? My presentation layout is, these are points that I will be discussing. The first one being about Africa for Nuclear, which is actually the campaign that I belong to, its goals and objectives. And I'm going to be discussing the nuclear energy developments in Africa. Also, I'll speak about nuclear as an energy source and the energy security needs of the African continent. Also, Africa's capabilities and our proudly African stories. And I will close with the cost of primary energy sources. Next, please. Basically, Africa for Nuclear is an advocacy campaign which was established in 2021 with the aim to promote nuclear as a key ingredient in achieving African Union Agenda 2063. And our vision is basically to become a driving force in the development of African states towards pursuing an energy mix that includes nuclear power as part of the strategy to move Africa closer to achieving its vision for the year 2063. We have very clear messages that nuclear has a major role to play in ending the energy poverty on the continent, because as much as we also have a climate change crisis, we also have a energy poverty crisis as the African continent. We also believe that nuclear can be a driving force to addressing the triple threats that have been identified by the African Union, which are poverty, inequality, and unemployment. It also has a role to play to help address climate crisis while supporting the continent's development, because I don't believe that the focus should be one-sided. We can't preach the gospel of climate crisis and completely ignore the gospel of the continent's development, because we are an underdeveloped continent. And lastly, nuclear is a key contributor to economic reconstruction and recovery plan, especially post-pandemic. Next slide, please. Goals and objectives. Basically, what we want to do is to put nuclear at the heart of Africa's agenda for sustainable development, while we are positioning ourselves as think tank on all nuclear things on the continent, and collaborate with stakeholders like you guys. And our objectives are to promote a conscious and well-informed society. We do that. So far, we are doing that through social media campaigns, and we also do short videos where we educate people about nuclear technology. We also want to be thought leaders. We are positioning ourselves as thought leaders, and so far we have done that through opinion editorials, events, and webinars like this. We contribute to different events and as per invitations. Also, we want to influence the energy policies to include nuclear by engaging policymakers, leaders, and other stakeholders on the benefits of nuclear power. And because in doing so, we will be realizing the SDG 7, which basically says it's essential for achieving the full set of all the SDGs. Yeah, thank you. Next. This slide talks about the nuclear energy developments in Africa, as per the report by the Nuclear Business Platform, the recent one, which was released. They were tied in, and they were grouped in different tiers, tier 1, 2, 3. And I will just touch on few developments that have happened in a couple of countries here, starting by what happened in Ghana, which where the USA and Japan announced a strategic collaboration to support the development of what is called small modular reactors, which is the new upcoming technology. So yeah, US and Japan, they will be supporting Ghana to deploy those SMRs. And also, it's very important to mention that this is subject to Ghana's nuclear regulation and the US export controls. In Uganda, they have acquired land for the construction of their first nuclear power plant. They want to add 2,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity in their energy mix. In 2022, the government of Nigeria launched a tender for the country's first nuclear power station, which is going to be a 4-reactor plant with a total output of 4 gigawatts. This nuclear power plant will provide about 1/3 of the country's present installed generating capacity, rather. In my country, South Africa, we have affirmed plans for a new 2,500 megawatts of nuclear power plant to end the procurement process by 2024. hopefully that will happen. And the Rwandan government has initiated the process to develop a nuclear center for science and technology and a nuclear power plant based on the upcoming technology small modular reactor. We are seeing the same thing in Zambia, where the government has also initiated the process to develop the Center for Science, for Nuclear Science and Technology. Thank you. Next slide. Nuclear as a clean energy source. I'm going to speak from African perspective. What do I think, why am I saying nuclear is needed and should play a role in our energy mix? It's because I believe that the access to clean energy in Africa, where we have over 600 million people who are without access to electricity, is critical for the success of global efforts to tackle poverty. Also, nuclear will guarantee, will help us to have a, guarantee affordability and security of energy supply. As Africans, we need to recognize nuclear power as clean energy to provide baseload to complement renewables in our just energy transition strategies. Also, currently the transport and agriculture industries are still highly dependent on fossil fuels. And if we actually implement or we build more nuclear power plants, they would help us decarbonize this industry. And also, we need actually to enable African countries to decarbonize without compromising energy security. As I said earlier on, climate change, development, they go hand in hand. For example, if you look at South Africa, they are planning to decommission more than 10 to 24 gigawatts of energy capacity from coal. And that has to be done by 2030. And therefore, nuclear can actually play a big role in replacing this capacity in an environmentally friendly manner. Next slide, please. Now, energy security needs of Africa's future power system has to be anchored on the following. The first one, the cost and affordability. I think as I continue with my presentation, I will speak about what I mean about this cost and affordability. And the second one, it has to be available, it has to be anchored on availability and reliability. We have to have a power that is available all the time that we can rely on. The third one, it has to have socio-economic impacts. As I said earlier on, we are a continent that's still to industrialize, and therefore, address our socio-economic challenges. Lastly, it has to have environment and to be environmentally and acceptable. And therefore, I believe that nuclear energy is the source. By the way, is one of the sources that meet all these requirements in order for Africa to prosper. Next slide, please. We hear a lot about Africa's capability or incapability. People are saying if we want nuclear in Africa, we don't have the skills. Therefore, this slide is basically addressing that in a way. We are going to look at the United Arab Emirates. They are building a nuclear power plant. Actually, they have connected their reactor, their first, I think, and second reactor to the grid. This is a country that had no prior nuclear experience. They had no prior licensing experience. They also had no siting experience, no operation of nuclear infrastructure before. Their construction started in July 2012 and was completed in December 2018. Therefore, it took 78 months for a country with no prior nuclear experience to connect their first nuclear reactor on the grid. They always say it takes longer to build nuclear. The UAEs, they took only 78 months to build their nuclear power plant. And we are talking about a conventional power plant here, not even a small modular reactor. So in Africa, we have South Africa, which have majority of, if not all of the above skills. We have Koeberg, which has been operating since 1984. We have a research reactor at Nexa, which has been operating since 1965. Next slide, please. I cannot speak about nuclear and not mention Proudly African Stories. And our one of our Proudly African story is Koeberg Nuclear Power Plant, which is based in Western Cape here in South Africa. A study which was done in 2017, a study of Koeberg Nuclear Power Plant, it showed a positive total national economic impact of 53.3 billion in South Africa from 2012 to 2016, and created government revenue of 16.4 billion rands. Koeberg sustained on average per year 1,786 direct jobs and created 14,110 indirect jobs. Koeberg nuclear power plant paid off items such as plant construction and financing cost, translating to average levelized cost of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Sorry for the mistake of megawatt hour, per kilowatt hour, taking into account fuel, operating and maintenance cost. Lastly, Koeberg's plant life extension to 40 to 60 years is currently, has actually been approved by the government. So this extension would basically mean that price stability to the consumer from essentially the same asset for further 20 years will be extended. Another Proudly African story is construction of Egypt's first nuclear power plant, which is underway. Next slide, please. Now, we hear a lot about how nuclear is expensive and therefore cannot afford it. And basically, you know, what is said is that people who are saying this are people who are end users like me and you. We are saying nuclear is expensive. And now, this slide is here to show you or to prove to you that nuclear is not actually expensive. This was extracted from the recent financial statements of our national utility, Eskom. This slide, actually this extraction is just a comparison of the primary energy unit cost of different energy generation sources. If you check all of them, we have coal, we have nuclear, we have renewables, independent power producers. Nuclear is the cheapest. So Eskom buys nuclear or buys electricity at 99 rand per megawatt hour. Coal is the next one, it's 440 rand. Then renewables IPPs, they buy it at 2,027. I don't know then what exactly are we saying by what exactly do we mean by saying nuclear is expensive? Do we want something like renewables that we will build at a cheaper cost, but then the bigger cost is allocated to us as end users? Or we want government to build something that actually will sustain us or will be cheaper to us as end users? Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, you can follow Africa for Nuclear. We are on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, also on TikTok as well as on YouTube. But basically, I'd recommend that you go on YouTube because there's more videos that educate about nuclear. Like, I'd like to close by quoting our late president, the first democratic president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural, it is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the action of human beings. As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Close quote. So I'd like to say to you, my fellow Africans, let us work together in building a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, the Africa that we want. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Princey. That was really insightful and interesting. So many lessons learned there. I think for me, it was really interesting to see the plans in various African countries towards nuclear energy and adopting it, and to see the example of the UAE and what they've been able to achieve with building their full power plant there in the UAE. I think that's a clear indication of what is possible for us across Africa. So thank you very much. I'm sure a lot of people will have questions for you, but we will wait till the end of the session, till the end of the next, all the speaking sessions before we actually take questions. So please, anyone who has questions for Princess, please just take a note of them or put them in the chat box and we will ask them later on. Thank you very much once again.
I'm
That was
sorry,
really
Jamina.
beautiful.
Sorry,
Yes.
Jamina. Sorry to disturb. I'd like to be released for now because I have to go back on the field. I will take questions
Oh,
via email. I will leave my email address on the chat. Then whoever wants
okay.
to, who has a question can simply email me. I will respond. Thank you so much for hosting me today. I hope this is a first of many good things to come out of this collaboration.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Also, so, I think someone's asking if they will be able to get access to the presentation. Is that possible, or do you have other resources you can share, perhaps?
It's possible. Chidiebele will be able to share my presentation with everyone.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right, thank you, everyone. That was truly interesting. Like she mentioned, if you have any questions for her, please put them in the chat box, or you can send them to her email address, or you can also just send an email to Chidiebele as well, and he'll get them across to her. For any resources, you can go to their YouTube page for more videos for information, and then also you can just reach out and we'll get them across to you. So thank you very much, Princey. So our next speaker is a seasoned nuclear energy specialist. He has an MPhil in nuclear energy from the University of Cambridge and over 7 years working in the nuclear energy industry. He is the managing director of Radiant Energy Fund, San Francisco, US. I'd like all of us to please welcome Mark Nelson. Mark Nelson, over to you.
Thank you, Jamima. And I think I should briefly introduce a little bit more of my background, because I think it will be important in understanding not only why I'm here today, why I've been invited to speak, but also my perspective. So I am from Oklahoma in the United States. Oklahoma is a place with oil and gas, famous oil and gas wells. It has one of the leading oil trading hubs of the world. It has cattle, and it has agriculture, and it has some aviation industry. But it is not famous for being rich. It is not famous for much popular culture. It's a place that produces energy and materials for other places in the world, other places in the United States. So I do not come from New York City. I do not come from even Houston, the energy capital. I'm from an area that's a little bit off the center of the cultural and economic power of the United States. I studied engineering, not nuclear at first, because I did not know anything about nuclear engineering. So although I have been introduced as a nuclear energy expert, and I have been aware of Princey's excellent work and have been working with her for a number of years, I'm here to talk about things a little bit further than nuclear energy itself. I'm here because Chidiebele and I met in Egypt only a few months ago at COP27, the climate conference that I think marked a turning point, I would argue, in climate conferences discussing energy. Now, you might think, of course, climate conferences should discuss energy because a lot of what's causing increased emissions is the energy sector. It's the majority of emissions around the world. But you would all be wrong. And I'll go into more about why this is such a bad problem. You are wrong to think that climate conferences have taken the issue of energy seriously. It has only been recently. And why was Egypt one of the very first climate conferences to take energy seriously? because for the first time in the energy transition period, there was a massive global price crisis of fossil fuels. Although there were high commodity prices, maybe 2007, 2008, it's different from the situation that we're finding ourselves in. Why? Because with all respect to Mr. Engineer Odo, who suggested developing gas resources, many developing countries had for the first time in 2021, 2022, found themselves in an extremely dangerous trap. What is that trap? Being committed to natural gas that arrives on ships, and those ships were becoming too scarce, too expensive, and were being bought in a panic by the richest nations on planet Earth. Right, so let's review. 2022, I'm in Egypt, I meet Chidebele, we are discussing energy in a time where effectively in a climate conference, the rich countries had bought up the fossil fuels from away from that was expected to be available, expected to be consumed in developing countries. Rich countries had extracted them from the market and then had come to the climate conference to tell you how maybe they might consider giving you money to remain poor while taking your energy supplies and burning them at home for themselves. So I'm going to pause for just a moment on that. The rich countries who claim to know how to help you with energy had messed up their own energy plans, had gone back on their own energy goals, and were making up for their errors by having enough money to buy up the energy that was expected to power billions of lives in the developing world over the next few years. That made me angry. I know I'm a professional and I like to stay professional, but as Chidebele can say, I was quite upset about this during those winter months. Now, we're a few months further. What has happened in the early part of 2023? Europe got very lucky with a warm winter. Because Europe got lucky with a warm winter, there might be a little bit more fuel supplies for the developing countries of the world this year, except they are now using that as an excuse, the warm winter that gave them luck. It was from luck. It was not something they engineered. It was luck. They are using that as an excuse to continue making energy errors that will have grievous consequences for you all, hundreds of millions of people, a few billion people across the developing world, depending on what fuel sources you commit to in the coming decades. So I've been asked to speak a little about what's happening in other countries, say the donor nations, the investing nations, the nations with big capital, who the developing countries will end up being dependent on no matter what they choose, at least at first. And I have a warning message about wind and solar that I think is not being shared properly across the developing world. And it's this: at the moment, companies selling wind turbines, one of the fastest growing energy sources ever, are not making money. So although we hear the wind and solar prices are lower, they're cheaper. I of course heard the words of Engineer Odo that coal is the cheapest fuel. Well, the word fuel is misused in rich countries now. They don't use fuel the way Engineer Odo used it. They use it to mean any energy source, not the ones that can save up in a stockpile and then be burned as needed. That's the traditional word for fuel. That's the correct usage, I would argue, that Engineer Odo used. But instead, when they say cheapest energy sources, wind and solar, when they say cheapest fuel sources, wind and solar, they mean something very different. They mean without regard to whether you have it when you need it, without regard to whether it supplies at the time and place you need it. They mean just anything that provides any energy anywhere. And that's when they say wind and solar is cheaper, therefore we will finance it for Africa. We will finance it for Asia and for South America. But the problem is that because wind turbines have been getting cheaper, they were getting cheaper faster than actual changes in the technology. Let me make that clear. Prices are not the same thing as costs. Prices are what you can charge. Costs are what it actually takes to build or develop something. And then finally, value. Prices, costs, values, very different. The prices for wind turbines were falling faster than the costs for wind turbines. Eventually, somebody had to pay. There's no free lunch, as they say, even in renewables. And what's happening is that Western wind turbine manufacturers do not make profits now. They make losses, partly because the old wind turbines they've already sold are turning out to be more expensive in maintenance than they expected. So now we have a little paradox I want to mention. And by the way, I just want to say, as I'm speaking, if there's any point that you want clarified or any question that you have, please put it in the chat. I will keep my eye on it. And then since I will be able to stay through the end of this presentation, I'll be able and interested to take questions, and I'll be as open and clear with you as I'm able. So back to the wind turbine cost versus price versus value conundrum. The countries that messed up their own energy supplies and are enduring this crisis, but have the wealth to buy their way out, they presume to advise you on which way to go in energy. I thought it was interesting that Engineer Odo mentioned the difference between what China is doing and what USA still has to 21% of its coal versus what they are willing to fund and finance in your country. Now, this is very important. You don't have to listen to anybody at all as long as you have all of your own capital. But as we know, that there's not an equal distribution of capital. People to do something for you now in order that they get something later. That's capital. So the capital being offered by USA, by China, by other countries is less and less and less towards coal and even less towards gas, the same energy sources that they themselves became rich using, that they themselves are still using today. So this makes an issue. If they got rich during one method, during one era, the coal, the gas, the oil era, can we believe them when they say that your path to being rich is to go another route? I would be hesitant. I would be very careful. Anybody you must ask, I think that we had this sense from Engineer Odo's talk, do not look just at what they say. Maybe don't look at what they say at all. Look what they're doing. Look what they're doing in their country and look at the trajectory of their country. I want to share a screen here. I'm just going to pull something up that I've been working on. It's still in draft form, so I haven't released it, but I wanted to provide at least something that was as fresh as possible. I'm going to share a screen here to an Excel sheet that I'm working on. Okay, right. So there's a reason why I'm showing you this today. Let me see if I can make the chart area itself. Anyway, so here's what I want to show you. This is the specific carbon intensity. For all practical purposes in this chart, this is how much carbon goes into the atmosphere for each bit of electricity made in Germany, which is the trend line up top, and France, which is the trend line down low. Over the course of this time period, 2011 to the end of 2022, Germany has spent about 500 billion euros between investment capital for wind and solar, transition funding to get away from coal and gas, early shutdown funding for their nuclear fleet, and then finally the addition of biomass and energy storage and various other technologies. What I want to show you in this final sequence here in 2022, do you see the carbon is creeping back up? It's creeping back up at the same time. It was creeping back up at the same time that Germany was buying ships that were previously headed to Pakistan or to Africa filled with natural gas. So Germany was failing with its hundreds of billions of euros spent, failing to achieve precisely the same energy mix that they are supporting, say, Nigeria to switch to. Now, you might say Nigeria has different options, and certainly other speakers said you should look to the strengths of your country. You should listen to the or you should have each country get what it's good at. But the truth is that in equatorial countries and tropical countries, wind power is weak, and solar power it's cheap in the sense that a tent or a bicycle is cheaper than a strong, sturdy steel frame building or an automobile. But the truth is that even though a tent provides temporary shelter, it's not the same thing as the permanent capital, the permanent wealth of a well-constructed building. And with a bicycle, I might say, although a bicycle quickly gets you from one place to another, as long as it's very short by, roads are safe, and you have physical health in order to bicycle, it's not the same thing as car, and certainly not the same thing as a train. So my final comment here before I open to question and put it back to Debele for comment is this. The countries that grew rich on coal, on gas, on hydro, and on nuclear, they have not yet discovered a way to make the price, to make the actual value of an energy system sustainable long-term using the sustainable energy technologies of wind and solar. However, there is now a sudden realization, and Princey mentioned it, and I didn't want to cover the same points of her talk, but there's a belated recognition in Washington, D.C., that nuclear energy must be financed for the developing countries, or not only will China finance it for you, but Russia will also do it. Russia is currently building nuclear energy around the planet. Russia is building nuclear plants, not just at home for itself, but they are building in Belarus. They are scheduled to build in Hungary. They are building in Turkey. They are building in Egypt, in Iran, in India, in Bangladesh, in China even. Russia is still building. And this is something that in Washington, D.C., the big international banking institutions that claim to be interested in energy development and poverty alleviation in the just transition, they just sat there and watched it unfold. And these power plants, which represent anywhere from 10 to 20 years of active construction and commissioning time period, from the start of deals to the start of construction to the finish of construction and the commissioning of the plant. These plants will then, from that 10 to 20 year period at the start, operate for anywhere from 60 to, I would argue, 100 years or beyond. In this last 40 years, America and its partners in the West simply failed to provide a good partnership across the developing world on nuclear energy. That time appears to be coming to an end. As we speak on this conference today, there are officials in Washington, D.C. drafting and promoting legislation that would order American directors at World Bank and at International Monetary Fund to provide financing for developing countries to get sustainable nuclear power. This should be at the top of our mind. I'm not trying to disagree with Engineer Odo. I'm not trying to disagree with Engineer Odo, who says that Nigeria must go forward with gas or with coal. I can agree that this is forbidden language in international energy transition. If you were walking the halls at the international climate conferences and saying the things that Engineer Odo was saying, you would be told this is not the way we're doing energy. We're doing energy, only clean energy now. But he would be correct in saying that's how the rich countries got rich, and that's what they're still using today. Well, I would argue as my closing statement that now that the tone, the idea in Washington, D.C. and in the West has changed towards nuclear energy funding, that you and those in your country should press for maximum information, for maximum support in considering and maybe even moving forward with a nuclear energy program during this window of opportunity, where even the fossil fuel nations of the world are exploring and even constructing large nuclear programs. Because in my professional opinion and personal opinion, that is the truly independent energy of the future. A nuclear plant run by your engineers for a century at a time, where only a tiny bit of fuel is needed, but it is fuel, it is stockpiled, it is on site, and it is available to you and your countrymen. That, I think, is it's not the lowest hanging fruit. In fact, I must insist, nuclear is hard. But it's hard and it's worth the journey it's not clear that other hard energy sources will be providing the same values in the future. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this morning. I'm here talking to you from Chicago, Illinois in the US, one of the greatest cities on earth powered almost exclusively by nuclear power. What I mean by that is it's about 7 to 8 million people in the metropolitan area, and of the electricity used in the city, between 70 to 90% reduced at a cost that significantly undercuts essentially every other energy source in the world, as long as it's already been constructed years ago. In Chicago, our nuclear plants are now 40 years old. They're going to be operating for 60, 80, 100 years, but we had to get over that barrier at first. The hard barrier, the high-hanging fruit, you might say, is the nuclear plant construction period that we've now overcome and now fortunately have secure, cheap energy. Much for having me on. I'll stay until the end of the time and answer what questions I may. So for the moment, I'll stop talking and quickly review some of the questions, but the moderator, Jemima and Jidabele, feel free to ask questions that you have yourself or ones that you found in the chat.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really interesting. And then, yeah, to sort of put the two talks side by side and see like different options and the alternatives when it comes to energy. It's really interesting to just hear about what sort of the countries like Germany and the US have used in terms of energy and the options that are being sort of like pushed forward for developing countries. So that was such an interesting thing to sort of look at side by side. Thank you once again. So everyone, we are open to questions now. If you have any questions, you can just type them in the chat box. But to start off, I'm really interested in sort of looking at this idea of clean energy, and I'm sure a lot of people have it on their mind as well. Do you, Mark, in your opinion, do you feel like clean energy can replace fossil fuels in Africa by 2050? Do you think this is possible?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I'm going to pick apart the question a little bit. You have one problem that the question says, can you replace dirty energy with clean energy? Maybe. Germany has replaced some portion of its dirty energy with clean energy. It hasn't added more energy supplies. And also, Germany was rich when they started that replacement process, extremely rich. And you might argue that Germany will be less rich having made some of that replacement. What's not at all clear to me is whether the clean energy can be added in total to what's currently there with good results. So let me say that again. If your dirty energy is this much, you might be able to replace some of that with certain types of clean energy. If your dirty energy is this much, it's not clear to me that you can get the proper amount of energy to develop your society from just any clean energy source. I'm very interested in time periods that proved the opposite or provided an example. Perhaps the most famous example is France, where in France, the energy supply, in this case, let's talk about electricity. With newer technologies, electricity can be very useful in a variety of different ways that were not as useful in the past. Let me say, if you have automobiles powered by diesel or by petrol, if you get electric vehicles, you can replace some diesel and some petrol with electricity. If you don't have the electric vehicles, it's more difficult to replace the petrol and diesel in the automobiles and in the buses, right? So not everything is immediately and easily turned onto the grid, onto electricity, but many things are. And let's assume for the purpose of this anecdote about France in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we are talking about the electricity supply only. The electricity supply in France in the 60s and 70s was heavily expanding based on oil, but it's still at a level that's quite small. They had a smaller amount of energy per capita coming from the electric grid. When the French government was shocked by the OPEC embargo and the oil price crises, they reacted in a certain way because they did not have their own fossil fuels. Let me say that again. France does not have much coal. They do not have much natural gas. They certainly don't have much oil. So in the 60s and 70s, the way they responded to the oil crisis was to go for a massive nuclear program. What was special here is that I think there's not going to be much debate in future years. Is nuclear clean? Yes. International organizations are saying it's clean. Banks are saying it's clean. Activists, advocates are saying it's clean. Physicists and engineers have known that nuclear energy is clean. It requires almost no mining and produces almost no carbon waste. So clean energy in France in the 70s as a panic response to the lack of fossil fuels in France led to a great expansion of total electricity supply per capita while displacing out the fossil fuels involved in electricity. But this is a thing we have not yet seen with solar and wind. China and USA are by far the biggest wind and solar producing countries on planet Earth. In both cases, it's not, as far as we can tell, a very large addition of total energy, certainly not in the USA. It's replacing other energies that were already capitalized, already built, already funded and operated in the US. And in China, it's almost a little bitty detail, little bitty shred of energy lost in the total growth of China's energy, which not only is coming from hydro, but also coal. And the amount of wind and solar added is only slightly more than the amount of nuclear energy added in China, both sources of which are tiny compared to the added coal power and hydropower in China. So to answer your question, Jemima, I'm not sure we have enough evidence to say that the clean energy can make you rich by augmenting, by going above and beyond your supply of dirty energy, even if on the margin, you can replace some of your fuels that you use today by some new clean energy sources, with the exception, in my opinion, as demonstrated by history, being nuclear power.
Thank you very much. Thank you for. I'm just going to look in the chat box to see if there are any questions for you.
I saw one that seemed quite interesting, which was, with the use of coal and carbon-based energy, do you think Africa has the resources for carbon sequestration? So I've been trying to keep up as much as I can on carbon sequestration news. For anybody not familiar with this phrase, the idea is that you get energy by burning, that is breaking apart hydrocarbon molecules, and then you take the carbon dioxide form, the gas, the waste product, and you put it in maybe some kind of form. Maybe you just keep it as a gas and concentrate it together, or you take it away out of the atmosphere so it is no longer involved in greenhouse gas effect. I would argue that the rich countries have almost no prospects for getting this right. I'm unfortunately very pessimistic about its prospects. And the reason why is extreme cost and extreme penalty on the energy produced. You're getting energy from carbon when you break the bonds, when you create the CO2. In order to go in reverse, in order to go backwards, it's extremely difficult in terms of physics, thermodynamics. You are putting the genie back in the bottle, you might say. You're trying to take what has given you the gift and wrap it back up again. The penalty, the energy penalty, the cost penalty for doing so is very high. Early estimates that I can rely on from the United States says that if you have a coal power plant and you're capturing the rich clouds of CO2 directly at the coal plant, and you're putting it directly in the ground pretty close by through pipelines, you're going to have to use billions of dollars to fund the retrofit of the coal plant. And then the energy penalty of capturing this CO2 is between 20 and 30%. It may be even higher. I think I've seen some numbers for some processes that are closer to reality. And they're not on the drawing boards. They're closer to reality, being energy penalties of 40%. Africa has the problem of not enough energy to say, let's pay billions and take off 40% of that new energy to put the CO2 back in the ground. It's simply not credible to me. even if there are good geology formations in Africa, which I don't know for sure. I would need to check with an expert whether you have the correct, say, old oil and gas wells that are not producing as much anymore. That's one of the candidates for putting CO2 back in the ground. This is a toy for the richest nations on earth, funded with the wealth from their cheap energy programs. I would be very cautious in taking any sort of optimistic view towards that carbon sequestration for most countries in Africa going, I would say, until the end of the century.
Yeah, just to add that, Mark, in fact, as a matter of fact, Africa has one of the deepest carbon sinks. If you look at Congo, if you also look at Nigeria, we actually do not have that legal and policy framework for carbon sequestration yet. But of course, I think because we've started exploration in Nigeria for over 60 years now, so I think we have that potential, but just that has not been articulated into some kind of legal framework and policies to drive that sequestration. But looking at that question, very importantly, we're looking at just energy. And even if we have this sink for carbon sequestration, for example, what is the market price, for carbon for Africa? If you look at it, it's really embarrassing, in terms of when I want to talk about just or rather justice in it, or the equity, or socio-economic inclusivity, and all those things. So you see there's a big difference with what we have in Africa currently, or and what you have over there. So I think all these things need to be put in place, and we need to have a proper legal and policy framework. Otherwise, we will not be able to thrive in that. But whether Africa has a good sink for sequestration, yes. Congo has demonstrated that, and to have the deepest carbon sink. So I just wanted to make that comment, and thank you so much for your comments.
I think we have another question here from Jerry Mbazar. Question to Mark: what nexus can we find for nuclear to complement gas as a transition fuel in Nigeria? So now we have something interesting. Until very recently, governments were willing to fund natural gas development for the developing world. That enthusiasm is declining. In the rich country capitals, there is debate and controversy on whether any more fossil fuels of any type should be financed. Now, of course, other countries may be willing to do that. For example, in China may be willing to continue helping to finance natural gas, as it's seeking natural gas for itself too. But the question here is, nuclear and natural gas, can they work together? Of course. The answer is there are countries around the world with very large percentages of nuclear combined with large percentages of natural gas. USA, for example, is 20% nuclear energy in the electric grid. And then the natural gas in the electric grid is anywhere between 30, 35, 40%, depending on market conditions. And the recent years, the interaction is mainly with coal and increasing wind and solar. So that's just one country. Other countries also have a mixture of nuclear and natural gas. So physically, or say from an engineering standpoint, answers, of course, they fit together quite well. The more common question that I get when talking in, say, Europe or in America is, if natural gas is here, doesn't that mean that natural gas combines with wind and solar better than natural gas combines with nuclear? Well, nuclear, as I said, is the high-hanging fruit with richest flavor, I might add. If it's easier to build wind and solar, and you cannot organize a nuclear program, or you do not get off the ground, or you do not assign your most talented people to it, you do not have the national faith, I suppose, to go forward with a 10-year or a 20-year construction program to achieve wealth and independence in later decades, then we don't need this question, natural gas and nuclear, because the default answer will be no nuclear, your natural gas will go with wind and solar. However, in my experience, natural gas is a very volatile fuel. The price goes up and down. Why? It's difficult to store and produce natural gas because of the enormous space that it takes. So I would argue that nuclear and natural gas are natural complements. Natural gas supplies being expensive is one of the reasons that countries are looking at nuclear again in Europe. So that might serve as a little bit of a warning. But also, natural gas economics work a little bit better with wind and solar than combining all three: nuclear, natural gas, and wind and solar. So that's the source of the argument that people say, if you have natural gas and renewables, you do not need the nuclear. I don't think it's possible yet to have a cheap energy system that is natural gas and renewables. In the end, the natural gas has too high a fluctuation in its price. And so I like the stability of nuclear to provide that economic and physical base load. That means a constant power source with known costs that are fixed long into the future. I think that makes a better investment environment for, say, big businesses coming to your country, even if the engineering is possible to mix renewables and natural gas quite easily.
Thank you very much, Mark, for responding to all the questions. Unfortunately, we're sort of running out of time now. So if anyone has any more questions, please can you put them in the chat box for later, or you can send an email, or I believe Mark has shared his Twitter handle, I believe, Mark?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you can reach out to him directly on there and ask your questions. Or like we mentioned earlier, send all the questions to the email address that Chidebele shared, and he'll get them across to Mark as well. So thank you very much, Mark. This was truly insightful and very interesting. I, for one, learned a lot. And just sort of looking at everything side by side and trying to understand the differences and the long-term effects of each sort of like energy source for transition. Thank you a lot for that. So for next off, we're just going to be sort of closing out the seminar, the webinar, sorry. And for that, we would like to introduce the acting president for the African University of Science and Technology, Professor Peter Azikwe Onwalu, to give the closing remarks. Prof, over to you. We have just about 5 minutes to go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jemima, for this, for being a wonderful anchor person. And let me also thank all the resource persons. I know somebody has left, but Mark is still with us. I want to appreciate the presentations. And this has really been a wonderful seminar or webinar for me, and I believe for everybody who has attended. This is one in a series of engagements that we have planned as Africa University of Science and Technology, especially to bring stakeholders together to begin discussions and conversations in the area of climate change and climate-related topics. This is preparing us for the kind of work that we have set to do under our Center for Climate Change. And I believe that when we have very knowledgeable and experienced people such as those who presented today, it will ginger more discussions and conversations. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is what do we do with these conversations? Usually at the starting point for looking for solutions. Somebody once joked that it appears people from Africa usually know a catalog of their problems. But after cataloging the problems, there are usually no solutions. And that's why the continent has continued to suffer from infrastructure deficits. So we hope that beyond these conversations, we'll now engage the speakers, and in fact, not just the speakers today, but all the other stakeholders that have joined us today. We now engage you further towards some of the projects that we are currently trying to implement. I'm sure Chidebele must have told you that we are trying to engage with partners. I believe in multi-stakeholder consortiums that can come together with great ideas that can solve problems. At African University of Science and Technology, this is at the back of everything we do. Everything we do is driven by the need to solve real life problems. And we have quite a bit of problems in Africa in general. So I believe that conversations like this can help us to begin to look for solutions, interrogate policies where those policies exist. A country like Nigeria has numerous policies that either have not been implemented or are being implemented poorly. So we need conversations like this to interrogate such policies. Where those policies do not exist, these kinds of conversations will enable us to come up with public policies that can address the various problems confronting the continent. When we come to the discussion today, this is an area that we don't even have the capacity in terms of understanding the technical things that are involved in analyzing different forms of energy. I know people have done a lot in these areas, but I believe that we can still do more. So I would like to thank everybody on behalf of the university, including the presenters, those who have joined this conversation. And we invite you to continue to yeah, sorry, I lost connection. As I conclude, I want to thank everybody again for your participation. And I believe that when we call you again, you will oblige and be with us. Thank you. Jemima, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you everyone for being here. As he mentioned, this is just the second in a series of webinars that we'll be holding. And we hope to have one bi-monthly. So at least twice a month, we will be hosting these webinars, and we hope to see you on the next one. Before then, we will share more information about it. So you'll be able to connect and just interact with us as well. With regards to any of the speakers today or any of the resources or content today, we can see your messages in the chat. We'll reach out to everyone who has asked for the resources that we can share. And as we mentioned earlier, for questions or comments or any other points, just send us an email or reach out to the speakers directly. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you next time.